Hi everyone, welcome to Off the Podium. I have Christopher Cerrone from, where are you based, Christopher? Brooklyn. Welcome to Off the Podium.
Thank you.
Obviously you have so many accomplishments, but the first thing that I read about you when I was interested in speaking with you was the Rome Prize and the Pulitzer Prize, the being a finalist in the Pulitzer Prize. So how did those come about?
I applied.
Yeah.
My friend Caroline Shaw, who I've known a really long time, was the youngest person ever to win, and I think she sort of inspired a lot of us.
Yeah.
And I think it was actually just the next year? I think it was. I was like, well, if Caroline won, I might as well throw my hat in the ring. And so, yeah, that was, anyone can apply for Pulitzer. And the same thing with the Rome Prize, where I'd been sort of just wanting, my family is Italian, my father is from outside Rome, and I feel like a sort of, I've done a lot of work based on Italian literature, so it just seemed like a natural thing to try to get to Rome for a year.
Yeah. And when reading about your education, I realized I have a podcast coming up with one of your teachers, David Bresnick.
Martin Bresnick?
Bresnick, yeah. Did I say that right?
Yeah.
I have some Martin. That's right, Martin Bresnick.
Yeah.
I have a podcast coming out with him after I returned from Korea end of August, so I'm super excited about that.
That's great.
Studying with well-known teachers, how and you study with David Lang too, and among others. How does that feel? I mean, what do you take from them? When you go to these master's or doctoral programs, you've kind of developed your own language in composition, I assume, and you get there and you have to maybe take on some of their ideas, or how have they looked at this approach, teaching?
Yeah. I mean, I had two really amazing teachers as an undergraduate. I studied at the Manhattan School of Music in New York, and I studied with two teachers. One was named Nils Vigeland.
Mm-hmm.
He just retired recently, but sort of an amazing teacher, and really, I think, got me on the path in a sense that I was going on in terms of getting me interested in sound, getting me interested in sort of a lot of the currents that I'm still very interested in. And just sort of one of those guys who's an amazing person at sort of getting your creative juices flowing.
Yeah.
And, I feel like if I were to teach composition, it'd be more fun to teach undergrads because they're like sponges. And
Mm-hmm.
Nils would give me this list of like 20 things to listen to every week, and I'd run to the library and listen to everything. And,
Yeah.
So I think he got my creative juices flowing, and then I studied with Reiko Fueting, who's a little bit less known as a composer, but really amazing both composer and teacher. And, he's from Germany. And I think there was something sort of like fundamentally German about his like method, where he's like, all right, now be organized, organize all your material.
Yeah.
And I was like, and it really got me sort of paring down. So those were both teachers who I think, even though my music sounds very different than what I was writing then, I think we're both sort of fundamental. And then each person at Yale I studied with sort of, I remember I first studied with Ingram Marshall at Yale, really amazing composer, sort of colleague of John Adams, and he's such a funny, sort of slightly aloof character, and I would bring in these really complicated scores every week, and he'd just be like, well, I don't know what this is going to sound like, Chris. I don't know. And it's sort of like oddly, after like a semester of doing that, really got to me, and I'm like, can I be more simple? Can I be clearer? Can I be, can I pare down my language and stop trying to be impressive?
Yeah.
And I think so. There was a big paring down period that happened around then, and I think that Ingram, more than anyone else, sort of gave me permission to just be like, okay, you can write beautiful music that's simple and clear, and also have its own complicatedness, but and complexity. Or I guess it's like I think maybe I learned the difference between complicatedness and complexity. To finally get to Martin Bresnick, Martin is funny because I think that the thing he taught me about were things were the most classical. I think Martin is the composer who really got me thinking about harmony and harmonic planning and large scale thoughts about that. And I remember he was like, he still like cites this to this day, where like I went into a lesson and like I had a piece that was in the same basic key for like 9 minutes, and he's like, well, what if you change key here? And I was like, what? That's crazy. And so, studying with him, and he would talk so much about like Schumann and, the way Schumann works with harmony and Schubert and sort of really, so Martin got me thinking a lot about that. And David, I'm trying to remember what we did in our lessons. David was always trying to have coffee. He's like, let's just go have coffee. I was like, okay, David. And then I remember us never talking about notes. So we always sort of talked about concepts and thinking about, it sort of makes sense, and you sort of like thinking about like how does, where do the players sit on stage and kind of big things like that are, very influential to me to this day.
So you got best of every part that you could get from all these different teachers. It's great.
Yeah, I Yale was a really great environment because they're very encouraging. I think I studied with 4 different people at Yale ultimately, and there was an environment where it was like if you some schools have this kind of like you must study with your master, and like I can't imagine it. I never studied with anyone for more than 2 years in my life, and I can't imagine after like year 2 you're just like, all right, I've sucked the lemon dry, and I'm going to move on. And I know some people study with the same teacher for like 10 years or something. I was like, I don't know what you get in year 9.
Yeah. It develops into something more than just a teacher. It sort of becomes maybe a friendly relationship, and it just you have a hard time of letting go of that person.
Totally, I understand. And I mean, it's a good lesson to learn though to not have that person because I remember sort of. My undergraduate teachers were so much more involved, and graduate teachers were much more like, all right, keep doing it, like, here's some ideas. But, eventually you have to not have a teacher and learn how to compose on your own.
Yeah. Well, you have been very successful at composing for orchestras, and every composer I talk to somehow tries to stay away from composing for orchestra, especially in the 21st century. I know there are young composers composing for orchestra, but it seems like there's, a lot of them composing for chamber music because it's easier, to find people to play the music. What's your approach been like? Because just recently I was reading you even had a premiere with the LA Chamber Orchestra.
I did, yeah. That was an interesting. It's an interesting experience because it was like such a good orchestra, and still it's a challenge. Like they're very good, and they're very good attitude too. Like sometimes you walk into an orchestra room and you're like, you guys are not gonna like this. Or you have to kind of puff your chest out, you know, in this bravado. I remember this. I had an orchestra rehearsal where like I had written like for the percussionist, I'm like, hit a tin can, and it's like seems so simple, like come on dude, like in a tin can. And he's like, what kind of can? I'm like, a metal can. He's like, what kind of metal can? I'm like, 32 ounces of San Marzano tomatoes, okay? And I was like, okay man, like, and I think that's an unfortunate aspect of what's challenging about orchestra music is that there is no room for error. And I think that music creation needs room for error at some point. When you write an orchestra piece, you might have the chance to make. I remember I asked Jeff to like repeat a bar one less time or something, like one less repeat, and I think maybe I like asked a couple people to not play in their parts, and that's about the level of revision that's possible with an orchestra piece. This was like a good orchestra, and we had about 2 hours of rehearsal for a 12-minute piece, which is standard to even generous, and that's not very much time to figure out what the music is, whereas like a chamber group, you send it to them, they rehearse it for 6 months, and so I almost feel like I've done both. I'm moving more, I think, into orchestral stuff these days. Just it's the nature of a composer's career, but they're just very different way. And the thing about the orchestra too is that it's like it only works one way. Not works one way, but it only works within. I don't know. It's like pouring sand into like a vase of a certain shape. It's like there's only so much you can do.
So you hold back. You hold back a little. Do you hold back as a composer?
Do I hold back?
In
terms of difficulty or what?
In terms of what, if you had the ultimate, freedom to compose whatever you wanted to compose on paper, and you didn't have to worry about the 2-hour rehearsal and the orchestra not being able to play, would you compose differently?
I think I would try more stuff. I think I would take more risks. And as it remains, I think that, and I don't think this is a conscious thing, I think just subconsciously, I always find my orchestra works to be like a summation of things I've developed in chamber music to a degree, and an expansion and a summation rather than an experimentation.
Yeah. Well, again, you've been successful. Maybe you don't want to give out all your tricks about how to about how to approach getting orchestras to play your works. But how does that happen? I mean, there's so many composers out there, and of course you've won a couple of prizes, and you've been successful. Yeah, you have all these degrees, and you've done all these different things. But how do you get to a point where an orchestra wants to play or premiere your piece, especially like an orchestra like the LA Chamber Orchestra?
Well, I think they came to my opera, and so they attended a performance there in LA that had done quite well.
Which opera was that? You've written 2 operas, right? Which one?
Like 1.5. Invisible Cities.
Okay.
Which is sort of my much more successful one.
Okay.
And yeah, and he loved the music and wanted to program the work, and so that was how that particular commission came about. But a lot of it's word of mouth, or a lot of it's, I mean, as your career emerges, it's so much about who you know, and I don't mean that in a it's who you know. It's just literally who you went to school with. But I mean, just in terms of who you wind up knowing. I don't find the awards track actually does that much for people in general. I mean, that field will pick out a couple of people who they like, and if you're not that person, then you kind of. And I wasn't that person. I mean, I later won a lot of awards, but as I was sort of emerging from grad school, I was not winning all the things I was wanting to win. So I just kind of kept on doing my own thing, and I think that was sort of what generated a degree of success. It was just a lot of commitment to working with collaborators who believed in my work, and sort of finding the collaborative forces, and that might be an orchestra conductor, that might and that might be a soloist, and then you wind up writing concerti. But it's really, I never set out to be on the orchestra path, and I'm still not. I'm just set out on the music path, and I don't,
Yeah. Again, having all these accomplishments, what inspires you? What
deadlines?
The what?
Deadlines.
What else though? There must be something out other than deadlines that inspire you to compose.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like my music sort of has this 2-pronged approach, or I feel like my music is very much about sound on one level. It's very much about exploration of instruments, and then it's sort of using that exploration to generate evocation, to generate emotional, memory-based things, and I think that's sort of, to me, the power of music is to have the purely sonic component, but then utilizing that sonic element to generate feelings, generate emotions.
There's so much talk about orchestras folding and music organizations not doing well. Again, you're still a young composer, but where do you see the future of orchestral music, since you tend to compose for orchestra? Is there a future for orchestral music?
I don't know. I was having a conversation with someone yesterday, and he very firmly affirmed that there would be no orchestras in 50 years. And I'm like, I don't know. I mean, if you look at it at the opposite direction, it's why does the orchestra still exist? It's sort of an interesting question. It's it's far beyond its cultural prime, if you will, in the moment where it was at the center of the culture, and it's still here. So there must be this need for this thing that exists somehow, and I don't know if it will exist as exactly it does now, or it'll exist in a totally different light. I mean, orchestras, I think, are right now figuring out the adaptation they needed to do 20 years ago, where it's just basic stuff why isn't every performance online that you do? Why, the power of the orchestra is a live performance, but in order to extend itself in a digital world, you need to have way more. I'm so excited because, usually you have an orchestra piece performed and no one can even hear it because of, union and rights and stuff like that. And I'm doing a piece with the Detroit Symphony next year, and they're webcasting it, and it's going to be webcast. And I'm like, that's amazing. I can't believe people actually be able to see my orchestra piece.
Yeah, and Detroit Symphony is another orchestra which, went through a really hard time, and they sort of made the right changes. They got the right people to do the right projects, and it kind of came back. And I was really worried about that organization because it's a very good organization. And I was so sad to see it going through those hard times, but I'm so happy that they're doing well, and it's great that you're collaborating with them.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because that was one of the things they negotiated in during the strike or whatever it was when they sort of renegotiated the new terms of the contracts of the players. They negotiated all this web streaming and all this stuff, and it's like, this is, I mean, it's sort of, I understand the way unions are, and that their job is to protect the rights of musicians in an age where there are fewer and fewer jobs, but, you know, on the other hand, like, we all need to work together to make the whole scene more progressive, so that, you know, I mean, everything should be like, I mean, you know, have you seen like the Berlin Philharmonic digital concert hall? Like that is the future of the field for sure.
And you know, you said it took them 20 years, you know, the orchestra world to kind of take on some of these projects, and it's really crazy because when we think of inspiring individuals or organizations throughout history, they've always been the ones that have, you know, taken the steps sooner and have taken, you know, have done things, whether it's composing for a certain genre or composing for a certain instrument. They've gone through, you know, they've just said, you know what, I know most people don't want to do this, but I'm going to be the first person to do it. Are we missing people like that in classical music today?
No, I think that they're there. I think it's just you're fighting a lot of built up bureaucracy and a lot of conservatism. And also, you know, I understand, you know, I had a meeting with an orchestra, a major orchestra, who I like won't name just because, you know, it's fine. You know, they weren't saying anything wrong. They're just like, okay, we have a 3,000 seat hall. We like new music. We want to program new music, but we're terrified. This isn't New York or LA. And, you know, we can't necessarily program a new piece and not have audiences be scared and not buy the tickets. It's not that they won't like it. It's that they're like, we can't sell out this house. And so, you know, it's, you know, having seen a little bit of how the sausage gets made, I do understand the challenges that they face. But also, I think that the ones who have been the boldest are the ones that are the most successful now. If you look at the LA Phil, I mean, they're amazing. You know, they're doing new music constantly, and they've spent 30... I mean, that's the other thing, is the organizations who are the ones who have spent the last 20 years doing this are doing really well. Yeah. And so, I don't know. I think it's just a long process, and also, it's about the trust between audience and... but also, like, I don't know. This is a hard question, isn't it? Yeah, of course. So, of course. Building trust between audiences and so curation is really important. Yeah. So you're oh, were you saying something? I was going to say that I think ultimately the field needs to expand its concept of what the music it performs is. Yeah. In a way that's not pandery. Yeah. You know, like the LA Phil had Sigur Rós play with the orchestra there, orchestrated by contemporary composers, and that to me is like a great way for like a different audience to come in, hear the orchestra, and actually hear contemporary composers too. And you know, I think that's the kind of future, is like sophisticated expansion of what the field is. Yeah. And you've studied with great teachers, and hopefully someday people will be fortunate enough to have you as a teacher. We'll see, What advice do you give to young you know, composers or musicians in general? What if there was something that you've learned throughout your career? What would you tell them? Or what would you tell the young Christopher who was kind of trying things out early on? I think it's sort of like keep going. I think sticking to your own vision for what it's almost like be a strong person. Yeah. And stick to your vision for what you want to do. But also sort of don't be so stuck. Like, it's a really hard line you pay where you're like, okay, like, stick to your vision, but also when some opportunity comes along, like, do not, you know, don't sneer at it. And so I think that there's, like, a really good, important incubation period for composers where they have to just, like, figure what they're doing out. And you know, I guess for me it was getting the chance to do a lot of collaboration with a lot of top-notch, you know, one thing my education afforded me, you know, all along the way is really top-notch performers. Yeah. And being able to develop a collaborative rapport with these people. Yeah. And that is so important to what you ultimately do as a composer. But also being able to adapt. I mean, it's sort of this like funny, contradictory advice. I've learned the most from my colleagues. Yeah. That's the one thing I'll say, like, every step along the way, your teachers are important, your colleagues are significantly more important. And, you know, when I was at Yale, I happened to just, like, be in this weird period where there were so many great, successful composers, you know, my classes, you know, Andrew Norman and Timo Andrus and Ted Hearn and, you know, people who are clearly on their way. And I learned so much from them, just in terms of both presentation. But I remember, like, I got to Yale and I didn't have a website, and everyone's like, I was like, oh my god, everyone else has a totally perfect website, and and so sort of that end of the game became increasingly important to me. And I think something else that's become really important, that remains incredibly important to me, is the quality of the materials that you present to the world. So, like, that recording better be really good that you send around, because if you think people can hear through bad recordings, you're wrong. People think they can hear through bad recordings, and at the end of the day, especially if your work is about a sonic object, you can't hear through that. I mean, imagine like an Alban Lucier piece heard in the wrong context would just be horrible. It's like noisy and like, what's even happening here? So, early on, I think I learned how to do a lot of recording stuff, and I learned how to edit recordings and produce them and compress them and, add reverb and all the things that like make a recording sound good. And videos and everything, just like your scores need to look amazing. Don't have like the horrible like orchestra score with like 64 fonts of every flute has a different staff, and like, just like don't give people an excuse to write you off. I mean, I think that's what it is. And there's too many composers in the world for all of them to have great careers, so it's like any chance to dismiss someone based on their Times New Roman default, tiny illegible orchestral score is like the first thing to go.
And it's crazy how in today's world, again, composers, musicians in general have to take on all these different responsibilities. You can no longer be just a composer writing your pieces. You have to make sure your website is up to date. You have to make sure the way you print your stuff, the way you present yourself, all these different things, and also have time to connect with these different people. You took time to talk to me today, even though my podcast is fairly new. But one thing that I saw today online was Norman Lebrecht's, the blogger. He posted,
Oh God.
He posted something, and I even wrote that I don't know how many of his posts are actually factual, but he posted something about 10 orchestras that are not very, very good at talking to the press. And I don't know how factual that is, but in today's world, in the 21st century, we just have to realize that as artists, we have to keep in touch with our fans and our audiences, and we have to be proactive about the way we do it. And it's unfortunate to see that major organizations that don't do that, or at least he claims that they don't. So, but I believe it to a certain extent, and I really hope that the new generation really steps it up and approaches it this way, and really goes out of their way in some cases to talk to people who will give them a platform.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of crazy when you think about these composers who had success in the 80s or 90s. It's like, how did that even happen? You had won some award, and then like a publisher signs you, and then you have a career, and that's sort of the end of it. And you like sit in your studio, like handwriting your scores, like mailing them off to some orchestra, and like I don't know. It seems a totally foreign world to me, honestly. Like I can't even conceive of it realistically.
In today's world, we talk a lot about diversity, and you have your Italian heritage, but what do you feel? I mean, is there enough diversity in music? Can we do more? No, definitely not.
I mean, is there enough diversity in music? If you like include all the music in the world, there totally is. Like, if you're talking about classical music, absolutely
classical music, and again in the world, is there enough diversity, or are we doing enough for there to be diversity?
I don't know. This is like such a complicated issue, and like I'm always like simultaneously very interested and always wary about stepping my foot in, because like now I'm a white man, I come from a certain amount of comfort and privilege, and so I look at things a certain way and have a certain set of values that I still like privilege and value, and I think that the thing I'm sort of coming to more and more is that you have to expand your notion of what it's like. You need to simultaneously hang tight to what you believe in while expanding your notion. I mean, if you look at composers in terms of like, you just define it as a composer who writes music on paper for orchestras or whatever, then like, there's a huge gender divide. If you look and expand the notion to be like, what if you consider people like Laurie Anderson or Meredith Monk, who are like amazing composers, or Pauline Oliveros or Pamela Z, or like any of these great people, I think that women have found their way into the field in different ways, possibly because of this big, there's been a lot of barriers for them in the field. I mean, it's almost like that silly Google memo that just came out where they're like, oh, women are like not genetically able to be engineers because it's like has bad like work-life balance. And it's like, well, what if we just like this is one system where that has happened this way, and clearly this has generated this. So that being said, I think it's also a really complicated thing because you're like I think the answer is sort of like you have to work really hard. Yeah. Like you have to work harder to be diverse than you do to not be diverse, and that's why people don't do it because there aren't as many people. But like there's a lot of composers. There's a lot of amazing women composers, a lot of amazing composers of color, a lot of amazing composers who are sort of not along the gender binary, and it's just harder to include them, and that's why. And it needs to be done, and you need to do it in a smart, sophisticated way.
We talked a little bit about getting audiences in the halls, but what else can we do? I mean, is there something that we're doing that's not correct? Because it seems like the population is growing in the world, of course, but the people attending the concerts is not. I mean, people, I hear all these things, a New York Phil sells out concerts, but, if you compare it to like 100 years ago, we should have 2 New York Phils in New York, and both of them selling out concerts.
Yeah, I mean, London has, like 7 orchestras or something?
Yeah.
Like, there's, 7 working orchestras in London. And I'm like, that's crazy to me that there's, basically 1 in New York. And there's, a bunch of other smaller orchestras, but it's, there's 1. And,
what are we doing wrong? I mean, there must be something that we should take responsibility for as artists, because we can't always blame the audiences. Of course, I wish the educational system was better for them to be more educated about the type of work we do, but we have to take some responsibility in this. And what's our responsibility, if any?
I mean, as a composer, the only thing I feel like I can personally do in terms of my work is there's 2 things. One is that you make good work. You make work that is good, and and I've always sort of had these values that I think are pretty broad and specific in their appeal. I'm interested in making beautiful music. I like music that is beautiful, and and that's. I don't think an artist necessarily has to have a responsibility to make that kind of work, but for me, it feels like I'm always calling my friends. I'm always texting them. I'm always hanging out with people. I'm a social person, and by that nature, my work reflects that. I love to communicate and tell people how I feel, and so that's to me the kind of interesting work that you can make. And then of course the other thing about it that's really important is that you need to speak to an audience beyond the coterie that is the people with master's and doctorate degrees. And I don't think it's very hard, and it doesn't mean that you have to be unsophisticated. It means you as a musician need to be more educated and more I need to be up on all the contemporary poetry and literature, visual arts. I feel that I have to be that person so that I can speak to those practices in contexts wherein they're understandable. And that is really, really important. And the musicians are terrible at that. They don't know anything because, and it's not really their fault because, you go, I went through 9 years of conservatory training with 2 required non-music classes or something, and so that doesn't happen. But I think personally that it's very important for us as musicians to be able to speak about our work in a way that other people can engage in that are not musicians. And if you only make work that is interesting, it's one thing to make work that's interesting musicians. There's another thing to only speak to people as if they were musicians. And so my program notes are not well, in the middle of the 3rd movement there's a modulation, and but the important thing is that it's part of the overtone series. So the 7th partial, and it's no, that's not how you talk about. You might if you and I want to talk about music that way, that's great because we're both professionals. But when you speak to the public, I think you need to speak in terms that they understand.
Yeah, for sure. Something more fun. What do you do outside of music? There must be something you do.
Nothing.
Come on.
I'm a very avid cook.
Yeah. It's interesting because a few guests at this point that I've talked to are all into cooking. There must be something with musicians and cooking that I haven't caught on.
It's basically sort of the same thing about it. And it's this repetitive practice that you work on a lot and you get better at, and it's very pleasurable at the end of the day.
Yeah.
I always have this thing where I'm like, well, I might not have written any good music today, but like I made a pretty good dinner. Like, it's very important, and it's like I always like, it's like you get to these really elaborate things where I'm like, oh, like basil, sort of like flat six chords in Schubert.
Yeah.
But I think this cooking is this natural. So many of my composer friends cook. It's true though. It's like crazy, and musicians in general. I think it's like part of the same impulse to make something, and to make something pleasurable for other people.
Yeah.
Like cooking for yourself is actually not very much fun. I always like to have people over because it's like, I made myself an okay thing, whereas like I made 5 people so happy.
Yeah. Well, what's next for you?
I am currently working on a string quartet for the Calder Quartet.
Mm-hmm.
It was commissioned by the LA Phil, and they will present the Calders in December. Then I'm working on a new percussion quartet for the Third Coast Percussion, and that will be performed at Miller Theater in March, along with it's a portrait of all my music, so it's an evening of works for percussion and voice. And so those are and then I'm working on this big violin concerto that will be premiered by the Detroit Symphony and Jennifer Coe. So that's my next year.
That's great. Anything good that we've missed? I mean, there's always something to talk about, but is there anything that you wanted to talk about that we didn't get to?
No, I don't think so. I think we covered a pretty good round of it.
And we could always do this again. I really enjoyed talking with you and talking about these different things. It's always nice to get a composer to talk about, sometimes non-compositional things, just the world in general. So I really like to keep these free form, so it's not just about the music, it's just about life in general. So I'll definitely include your website in this so people could check it out. It'll be on iTunes in September, but it'll be on YouTube probably in the next couple of days.
Sounds good. Just send it to me and I'll post it up.
Thank you so much. It was great. Thank you.
My pleasure. Take care.